It was on April 19, 1993, that the 51-day siege of the Branch Davidian compound at Waco, Texas, ended literally in a rage of flames. And in those flames died a 33-year-old man who claimed to be the Lamb of God. He died along with many of his followers, 79 of them to be exact, who also believed that claim. Well, at least the adults among those 79 believed. Sadly, the young children among that number, they likely didn't have any choice about whether or not they were going to be there. Whether or not it was appropriate for the United States authorities to take the action that they did will likely be a point of controversy and a point of debate that I expect will never be settled. But whatever the case, it is a tragically sad story of people who in effect worship this man as God, giving him their trust, giving him their worship, giving him their devotion, and for many of them, ultimately giving him their lives. An article in the March 15, 1993 issue of People Weekly says of David Koresh, one of his teachings was that he was the Lamb, or the Son of God, something most of his followers grew to accept without question. A book titled Prophets of the Apocalypse, published in 1994, fleshes out some of the belief and some of the teaching of this man named Vernon Howell, who changed his name to David Koresh. So quoting from the book, it says, one of the most important doctrines ever taught by Vernon involves the Lamb, mentioned in Revelation chapter 4 and 5. Christians have traditionally viewed the Lamb as a symbolic presentation of Jesus Christ. In 1988, however, Vernon began identifying the Lamb with someone else. In a formal letter written to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Why did he write to the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Because when he was young, he had grown up in this denomination and seemed to have a lifelong desire to somehow convince this denomination that we should follow his teachings. This is what he wrote. He wrote, all the prophets of the Bible speak of me. I am the branch, the Lamb. So now Vernon was claiming to be the Lamb of the New Testament, thus establishing the foundation for his declaration to be the ultimate source of truth. So quoting Koresh now, this is what he said. He said, do you know who I am? God in the flesh. I will be exalted amongst the brethren. Stand in awe and know that I am God. I am the Son of God, the Emmanuel. My name is the Word of God. I am all of the prophets, all of them. Incredible statements. The May 13, 1993 cover story of Maclean's told of two Canadian women who were living in the Mount Carmel compound, sometimes referred to as Ranch Apocalypse, when the standoff with the authorities began. There's two ladies there, and one of the ladies, they're both from around this area. One of those ladies was someone who lived here in Toronto. It's possible that some of you who have lived here for a while might have even known her in the past. I don't know the lady on the bottom, but the lady at the top, Gladys Ottman, she was someone who lived around Oshawa when I used to live there as a kid growing up. But what really caught my attention in that magazine was a picture of her daughter Ruth in a wheelchair, specifically that picture that I've highlighted there. Because Ruth went to College Park Elementary School, where I went to school growing up. She was a few years ahead of me, but she was in school at the same time I was in school. And even though I didn't particularly know her much, she was a few years ahead of me, I remember being in the library in Melfort, Saskatchewan, where Sandra and I lived in 1993, and I remember looking at this magazine. I wish I had bought a copy of it. I ended up having to now buy a electronic subscription to Maclean's for all time or something like that. But anyways, I remember picking up this magazine in the library in Melfort and opening it up and looking at this article and thinking how strange it was to see someone that I recognize. I'm like, hey, I know who that is. To see someone I recognize featured in such a story. It's like, what in the world? You know, Ruth was one of only 9 people who escaped and survived the inferno, and this is her account of it. As she clutched her Bible, she could feel the heat rising around her and worried that her yellow plastic sandals might melt. So she changed into running shoes and she started looking for a way out. She ultimately jumped from either a second-story window or a hole that was punched in the wall and stumbled forward, smoke coming out of her clothes. This was supposed to be supposedly a picture of just very shortly after Ruth jumped out and escaped from that building. So an agent spotted her, he climbed out of his armored vehicle and he ran to her, disappearing into the black smoke. But by the time he reached her, she was already trying to go back inside the building. And she apparently struggled to fight him off. But he was stronger and he dragged her to safety. She ultimately suffered a broken ankle and burns to her shoulders and arms and hands. Ruth Ellen Ottman, or Ruth Ellen Riddle, was sentenced in 1994 to 5 years in prison for using or carrying a weapon during a crime, and she was released in 1997. Ruth's mother, Gladys, had left the compound actually 25 days before its fiery end. But even after it was all over, after all of this had happened, her devotion to Koresh continued, and she's quoted as saying this: "It was like I had another love. I had found God. I love God, but I didn't really know him before I met David Koresh." And this is Gladys several years later speaking at a memorial service, still very faithful to David Koresh. This tragic saga of people's seemingly blind devotion to a false Messiah calls to mind others, particularly Jimmy Jones and the 1978 Jonestown massacre in Guyana, where followers apparently willingly cooperated in a mass suicide, just a small portion of the number of people who died in that massacre. And ironically, it was also in 1993. I don't know what was going on in 1993, but it was in January that one of Canada's most notorious criminals, Roch Thoreau, was finally sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole until the year 2000. He was denied parole in 2002, and then you might remember hearing a few years ago in 2011, at the age of 63, he was murdered by another inmate at the penitentiary in which he was incarcerated in New Brunswick. As the leader of what he called the Ant Hill Kids cult, Thoreau claimed to be king of the Israelites. And the disturbingly sickening story of how he murdered, tortured, and maimed some of his followers is completely revolting. If you don't want to have an unsettled mind, don't look up his story. It's troubling. And yet almost more unbelievable than his crazed cruelty is the fact that 3 of his female disciples, even after all that they had been through, moved to cabins situated less than 1 kilometer from the penitentiary gates where he was incarcerated so that they could continue to visit him and continue to bear him more children. Bore him 4 more children while he was in prison. Their loyalty and their devotion to him remained strong. And I don't want his face to remain on the screen. People who worship people, making another human being in essence their God. You know, it is hard to understand how people can remain so fiercely loyal to some of these leaders and some of the atrocious things that they did. Just say, how can you even do that? And yet Jesus had warned of such things in the last days. For example, in Matthew 24:24, where he said, "For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect." Now, of course, this concept of people worshiping another human as a god is really nothing new. It's not something just for modern times. Study of the ancient Near East reveals that it was not really that uncommon for a king to claim divinity and to expect and require worship. He may not claim to be the only God, but if he was powerful enough, he, it seems, felt that he had the right to join the ranks of deity. Now, I would be very surprised if there are any Canadians who think of Justin Trudeau as a god. when he was elected, whatever it was ago, you would get the impression, hearing from some people, that maybe he was a god, but maybe there's been enough time, water under the bridge, that people have figured out maybe not so much. Or how many Americans do you think see Donald Trump as divine? The idea seems almost bizarre to us, right? Today in our Western democratic culture, but in times past and in places distant, a king didn't become a king at the polls. He became a king on the battlefield. So if a ruler got powerful enough to claim divinity, I mean, really, who's going to argue with him? You want to be God? Okay, go ahead. And if my memory of history classes serves me correctly, and I'm scraping way back into the recesses of my brain, so I might have this wrong, but was it not the people of the great Inca Empire in South America who ultimately ended up worshiping some of their own people as gods? Isn't there a story about that? They went off and got these wonderful clothes and came back and, oh, they're gods? That may be true or not. I'm pretty sure it is. I think I remember that. And it's not just in recent history. Instances are recorded in the Bible as well of this same kind of scenario. For example, you probably recall the story of how Daniel got to spend a night with the lions, recorded in Daniel chapter 6. Remember that story? Daniel's enemies proposed a decree to King Darius that for 30 days no one was to pray to any god or any person but the king, and Darius signed the decree. Apparently, he didn't seem to have a problem with being prayed to. And you may remember the case of Simon the magician in Samaria, about whom people said, as recorded in the Bible in Acts 8, verse 10, they said, "This man is the great power of God." Think about it. Even Cornelius the centurion was willing to fall down and worship Peter when that apostle came to visit at his house. People willing to worship other people, and people willing to be worshiped by other people. I invite you to open your Bibles today with me and look at a glaring example of this type of thing that's recorded in Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12 is where we find the sad story of King Herod. Acts chapter 12. This chapter tells of how Herod, who was desiring to win favor with the Jews, was persecuting the Christian church. So he killed the apostle James, but then his next major target, Peter, was miraculously saved by an angel. And then it kind of seems like Luke, the writer here, kind of in the fashion of Paul Harvey telling the rest of the story, it's like Luke decides to tell the rest of the story about Herod. So let's look at it, beginning at verse 20. Acts chapter 12, beginning at verse 20. Very interesting story. That's the last part of Herod's story. It says, "Now Herod had been very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, but they came to him with one accord, and having made Blastus, who was the king's chamberlain, their friend, they asked for peace, because their country was supplied with food by the king's country, by Herod's country. So on a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat on his throne and gave an oration to them. And the people kept shouting, 'The voice of a God, and not of a man.'" And here's the end of the story. "Then immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give glory to God, and he was eaten by worms and died." The end. Not the end of the sermon. Don't get your hopes up. What a story. But it's really quite a statement that we read in verse 22, and that's really the part of the story I want us to think about. Look at that again. "And the people kept shouting, 'The voice of a God, and not of a man.'" The voice of a God and not of a man. Now this was, whoa. Where are we? There we go. This was Herod Agrippa, or Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa the First, called by different names. The problem here is there were 6 people named Herod in what is called the Herodian dynasty, so it gets a bit confusing as to who was who. Everybody and their uncle kind of literally was named Herod. So you got to kind of sort out when you're reading about Herod, who is Herod. So this Herod is Agrippa, I don't know if you can see this up here, but that's this guy here, Herod Agrippa I. That's who we're reading about in Acts 12. Now, he was both the nephew and the brother-in-law of Herod Antipas. So he was his nephew, but somehow he also married his sister, so became nephew and brother-in-law. It was kind of an interesting family they had going there with lots of interesting side notes. But Herod Antipas, this guy here, he was the one who killed John the Baptist. Remember? His head lopped off. He was the one who Pilate sent Jesus to during his trial. Now, Agrippa followed after that time, Agrippa I, and he had become quite powerful by this time. He eventually actually became ruler over the whole territory that his grandfather, Herod the Great, had ruled, which was the biggest territory of all. Now, Herod the Great was the one who was in power when Jesus Christ was born. So Jesus Christ is born, it's Herod the Great. Come to the end of Jesus' life, and you were at Herod Antipas. Now this is after that time, and we're at Herod Agrippa I. All right, does that make sense? So now Herod Agrippa is living in his capital at Caesarea, and the special day that's mentioned in Acts 12, verse 21, arrives. This is supposedly a painting of Herod Agrippa going to the amphitheater. I don't know if it's on that day or not. So the Jewish historian Josephus says it was a day set aside for a festival in which vows would be made for the emperor's safety. But it seems to me as we read the story that the focus was a lot more on Herod the king than the focus was on the Roman emperor. Apparently the deal was Agrippa's royal apparel included silver clothing. And they said that he came out there early in the morning in the full sunlight, and he was just sitting there glittering in the sun as he sat on his throne. And he must have appeared quite magnificent. You can imagine him there just sparkling in the sunlight in all his royal glory. Now, I don't know what he said in his speech, but it must have been pretty impressive. It must have been something that would match his glorious appearance. In fact, his presentation was so moving that the pagan crowd, most of whom I would suggest or guess probably quite likely imbibed in a festival drink or two, they joined in this united shout of worship and flattery to this glittering monarch, the voice of a god and not of a man. Oh, what an exciting day. One author in her book, The Acts of the Apostles, described the scene like this. It says, they were dazzled by Herod's decorations and charmed by his deportment and oratory. And wild with enthusiasm, they showered adulation upon him, declaring that no mortal could present such an appearance or command such startling eloquence. They further declared that while they had ever respected him as a ruler, henceforth they should worship him as a god. So here we have a great multitude of people ascribing divinity to a human ruler. Their worship of him now would be in the sense of worship given to a king or an emperor who was considered to be divine. To view Agrippa as a god would not mean that they would have to see him as the only god. It wouldn't mean that they could only worship him when they're saying, you are a god. But rather they were just declaring their willingness to consider him to be in that realm, to have that status of deity. So looking at this biblical story, let me ask you this. Can this be compared to the devotion of followers of men in more modern times, men like David Koresh or Jimmy Jones? Is this the same kind of situation going on here? I think if we compare it, a comparison would reveal some similarities, but also, I think, some important differences. So let's look at the similarities. There is the common element of people being willing to see another person as divine and in one way or another worship that other person. Along with that, there also seems to be this common factor that as you read these accounts, an important part of what draws these people seems to be the outward characteristics of the ones that they are worshiping. Things like their appearance, things like their speaking ability. All of these guys, David Koresh, Rock Thoreau, all quite convincing speakers. Jimmy Jones, King Herod. And so the focus of attraction seems to be more on outward show and powerful, persuasive speakings more than a focus on the person's inner character and qualities. So there are some things that are the same, but there are also some differences. The people that we see following someone like a David Koresh seem to do so out of a true religious conviction that this is God's plan. They seem to do so believing that this is what God would have me to do. Their worship of a man seems to be for them a matter of faith and belief. Now, it's true, there's other factors here. You have to take into consideration the elements of brainwashing and psychological isolation that seem to play a role in building that conviction in these followers. But they're still choosing to be there because they believe this is what they should do. The commitment that develops is one of spiritual faith. It's of belief. In the case of the shout of praise given to Herod, it seems a bit different. It would seem that the worship there had certainly more of a practical, convenient nature to it. Because let's face it, if the majority of the people are going to consider the powerful king to be a god, you might as well go along with it. Why not, right? I mean, sure, you may believe and worship other gods, but it's not going to hurt you to worship the king as well. In fact, it's probably in your economic and social interest to do so. So the worship that we see there doesn't seem to be the worship of deep spiritual conviction. Rather, it kind of seems like convenient, popular worship that flattered a popular and powerful ruler who had put on an impressive display. It's kind of a different kind of a scenario. And should a new Roman emperor come to power and decide to depose Herod, probably nobody in the crowd would give a second thought to giving him any further worship. Probably nobody in that crowd was willing to go down in flames for him, like those who followed some of these other leaders. But right at the moment, he was powerful, he was stunning in appearance, he was eloquent in speech. So hey, let's consider him to be a god. Why not? Remember, too, that there were many in that crowd who specifically, frankly, had a lot to gain from showing their support for Agrippa as a god. Specifically, the representatives that we read about from the cities of Tyre and Sidon. They needed desperately to make peace with Herod. They needed to win his favor. The economies of their cities, the livelihood of their people back home depended on it. And I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if they may not have been some of the first ones to suggest this idea of Herod being a god. Hey, this guy's like a god. I don't know. Maybe they weren't, but I can imagine they might have been the ones to start it. Whatever the case, their worship was simply a case of smart political and economic maneuvering. And it's very interesting to look at what happens in this story. It wasn't Herod who said, hey, I am a god. It was the people who chose to say to him, shout to him, you are a god. High flattery to a very popular and powerful and influential leader. So when I look at what's happening there, really it's more of I guess I would call it a selfish kind of a worship. It provided an opportunity for personal gain. It was advantageous. So what about today? What about us today? What do we see in our world? Does any of this have any relevance for us today? It's the question we should always ask. Are there people today who worship other humans as a god? Does that still happen in our world today? Obviously, I've already mentioned a sample of some of the more extreme cults that we've seen in more recent times. Overall, though, at the end of the day, these cults tend to involve just a very, very small portion of our society. But we can look around a little further. We can look at the world's largest Christian denomination, look at the Roman Catholic Church. And we can see the worship that many of its adherents give to its chief human leader. Now keep in mind when you think about that many of these people who do so are doing so based on the teaching that they have received. And they're doing so based on the sincere conviction they hold that authority rests not just in the Bible, but both in the Bible and in tradition. Tradition meaning the cumulative teachings of the church. And thus, when they do that, they're being true to their beliefs and their convictions. In accepting as authoritative the teaching of tradition regarding their church's leader, which says that the Pope is in effect God on earth. It's not so uncommon in our world today. And then I wonder if maybe some of today's popular musicians and athletes and entertainers and other celebrities, are they not worshipped by some in our society almost like gods? You see the way people act around some of these people, the way they devotedly follow their lives. Have you ever seen some of these people step out on the red carpet and look at the people around them? Sometimes they display a greater sense of worship than maybe we display when we come to worship God. They can't get close enough to them. They can't spend enough time to be around them. And you know what also, as we think about this, there's this, I don't know what to call it, but kind of new age type of movement that we have toward, personal and individual spirituality. Our society is big into that. I'm not a religious person, but I'm into personal spirituality, which really, for all intents and purposes, is basically people worshiping themselves as God. It might sound very pious, but it's really making yourself God. They believe they only need to tap into the wisdom and power inherent within themselves. Everything I need is within me, and if I just tap into that and follow that and be guided, I will be whatever I want to be. You know what that's called? It's called making yourself God. That's what it's called. So yeah, I think that the scene of Acts 12 is in some ways, and in many ways it often is, an issue for us today. It is repeated today in our society. We do still have this thing going on of humans worshiping humans as gods. Now, of course, the ultimate background to all worship directed toward any other but the true God of heaven is found in Lucifer. It's found in Satan. And it's not ambiguous. Isaiah 14:14 records very clearly his intentions, where he says, I will be like the Most High. That's not vague. That's not fuzzy. I will be like the Most High. That's the source of it. Our understanding of the prophecies relating to the last days on this earth tell us that ultimately humanity is going to be divided into two groups, right? Those who are true worshipers of God receive the seal of God, while the other group receive the mark of the beast. And right now, as we consider humanity, while we have seen that there are many people who worship God or various other people or gods, frankly, there are also a lot of people around us who don't seem to have a conviction towards worshiping anything or anybody or any kind of God. Rather, their time and attention is simply focused on the affairs and pleasures of their own lives. They're just not religious people, right? Aren't there a lot of just not religious people around? Now, Revelation 13 describes a beast power empowered by the dragon, or Satan, and then it describes a second beast which has the power to cause the inhabitants of the earth to worship the first beast. And the second beast then has an image or a pattern of the first beast made, which also is then to be worshipped. So, when you think about that, you might stop right there and ask or wonder, really? How's that going to happen? What's going to cause so many people to worship this beast and the image that it represents? Because the Bible shows that eventually all people will either worship God or they'll worship this other power. But what is going to cause people to choose to worship this power, especially when you consider that it must be a human power? Why do I say it's a human power? Because I believe there's only one true God, the God of heaven. And the only other supernatural power is Satan, who is symbolized in Revelation 13 as the dragon. But the dragon is not the one in the forefront here seeking worship. Rather, he is depicted as the secret driving force behind the beast power. So that means the beast power must be a human institution with a human leader or human leaders, since it is in opposition to God, and Satan is shown to be working in the background. So you take all of that into consideration, and the question arises, what's going to cause people to worship a human system or a human power? Well, obviously there will be many who will already be worshipers, and so their continued worship will be normal for them. It will be staying the course. They will worship based on their former religious convictions of faith. And then for others, just as many in that multitude who worshipped Herod were dazzled by the combination of Herod's appearance and speech, it's interesting that Revelation 13 and 14 tells of this beast power being able to perform great wonders and miracles. So no doubt many will choose to worship based on this spectacular outward display of this human system symbolized by a beast. And take a look at Revelation 13, verse 16. Let's go to Revelation 13. Look at this a little bit. Revelation, last book of the Bible, chapter 13, verse 16. Thinking about who people worship and what people worship and why people worship. Revelation 13, verse 16, and it says, and he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. So this text tells of people receiving what we refer to as the mark of the beast, indicating their loyalty to or their siding with the beast and its image. And notice that the mark is described as being received in two ways, either on the person's right hand or on their forehead. Those whom we have described, those who already have a religious faith in the beast power, or those who perhaps choose to worship it based on its display of miraculous power, those would be the ones symbolized here as receiving the mark in their forehead. Because their allegiance to this power is one of choice. It's one of their belief in it. They willingly side with the beast power because they've come to believe that it merits worship. But it still leaves the question, what about the other people? What about the rest of the people? There's a lot of people on this planet. What about the ones who frankly have no religious convictions? The ones who maybe even are impressed by the miracles of the beast, but they don't particularly feel any need to worship it. They're like, yeah, that's cool, but it doesn't matter to me. What's going to cause them to choose to receive the beast's mark in their right hands? It's going to cause that to happen. Well, the answer is in the two verses surrounding the one we just read. So let's look at that. Revelation 13. Let's look at verses 15 and 17, but we'll read 16 as well. Where is he reading from? Revelation 13:15. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. That's pretty intense. And he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So here, if we read that, it becomes pretty obvious why people would choose to worship the beast in its image. To not worship means to risk not only being cut off from the marketplace, it means to risk death. That's a pretty big risk. Death. Worshipping then becomes for these people a matter of practicality. It's convenience. It's a matter of survival, right? Which means it's more for selfish reasons. It's not so much about worshiping something because that person, that being, that entity, that organization deserves worship. This is about worshiping for protection, safety, and well-being of the worshiper. And I think that's why the mark is represented as being in the right hand. It's not based on a conviction of faith in the heart and mind, as is the mark represented in the forehead. Rather, this is really simply an outward compliance with a powerful entity. And were the beast's power to back off and not threaten life or economic control based on worship, then probably those with the mark in the right hand would most likely cease to worship it and say, okay, pressure's off, I'm done, I'm going to go about my life. So these people represented as receiving the beast's mark in their right hand can be compared, I think, in some ways to many in the crowd who worshipped Herod Agrippa, particularly those people from Tyre and Sidon, because they gave worship and praise to a powerful ruler because it was to their benefit, it was to their advantage to do so. There was really no other logical reason for that delegation to worship Herod. He wasn't their king. I mean, if they were going to worship some ruler as a god, it would have made much more sense for them to be worshiping the Roman emperor, because it was under his jurisdiction that their cities came. I mean, even Herod himself was under the jurisdiction of the emperor. So if you're going to worship someone as a god, why not go to the top and do the emperor? Didn't make logical sense from a worship standpoint to worship Herod. But to secure Herod's favor, to hopefully obtain a better economic and political situation, they joined in the worship of the king. Because at the moment it was a popular thing to do. And that's probably the reason why many in the multitude, frankly, were worshiping the king that day. Good show, king. You're looking good. You're sounding good. You're a god. So as we see things shaping up in the light of Bible prophecy, maybe you've sometimes wondered to yourself, as I have to myself, how is this thing going to go down? Are all of these secular people around us really going to consent to worship this end-time power? It's hard to imagine, you know. It's hard to imagine. Will they really join forces with the power that opposes God's true people, who are described in Revelation 14:12 as those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus? Are people going to really line up against that? Well, if you think about it, for those that don't have any strong convictions about worshiping anybody or anything, if it comes down to a matter of life and death, even if it comes down to a matter of food on the table, it's not so hard to envision people being willing to join in worship of the beast power. Hey, if that's what I got to do to eat, no problem. Besides, it'll be the popular thing to do. Because if this crowd was willing to call Herod a god because of one speech, then I have to wonder how much more in the crucial last days will people be willing to join in the worship of a human system that the Bible depicts as being secretly backed by Satan. You know, the end of Herod makes very clear the danger for those who presume to request or accept worship from others as a god. The fiery destruction of David Koresh hauntingly foreshadows the ultimate fate of all human and supernatural beings who attempt to usurp divinity. And thus we are warned of the fallacy, the danger in worshiping any other God but the true God of heaven, the God who came to earth and became a human to save the people that he created. To worship any other but the God who came to save the people that he loves. He is the only human who was God and is God. You know what? Herod had taken great pains to win the favor of the Jews. He wanted to be in good with them. And so he had observed the various ceremonies. He had participated in the various acts of their faith, which means that he was well aware of God's law, including the first commandment recorded in Exodus 23 that Carl read for us earlier. You know, that commandment that says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Another way to say that is, no other gods besides me. It plain and simply, you know what it means? It means no other gods, period. God is to be, and in fact is, the only God. That's what he claims. Now, I expect that most, if not all of us here today would say, "Oh, I would never worship another person. I would never worship another God, not me." And I certainly hope and pray that's true for all of us here. I hope none of us would do that. Even though we have this warning mentioned earlier from Matthew 24:24 that false Christs and prophets will try to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. That's serious. I would hope that our knowledge of God's truth, I would hope that our relationship with the Lord would prevent us from ever giving in to give worship to anybody else. I hope and believe that I would never do that. I would certainly hope that no Adventist Christian would ever give worship to another based on religious convictions. If you know God and you know what Jesus is about and you have a relationship with him, really you're going to find a better God? Come on. But I wonder if what may be the stronger test for those of us who have had the privilege of knowing Bible truth, I wonder if the stronger test may not be the temptation to worship another out of convenience. You may not be able to convince me there's a better God, but if I'm under pressure, would I worship out of convenience? Because, man, financially times are tough, right? Things are hard. Our world is messed up, scary. Crazy things are going on all the time. People are stabbed every day, shot every day in this city. People are blown up all around the world. People are out of work. People are stressed. And many people in our communities and people in our churches are feeling the effects. And in this uncertain world, we don't know what the future holds, man. We don't know. So how important it is that we take the opportunity to make sure our commitment is firm to serve and to worship God and God alone. It was one of the essential truths for which Christians stood in the Reformation. We seem to like Latin. Soli Deo Gloria, which simply means to the glory of God alone. To the glory of God alone. God won't accept worship that's based on convenience or on selfish motives, which might have something to say to the whole Christian prosperity gospel movement. I believe that God only accepts true and sincere worship that's based on love. He accepts worship that is my loving response to His love for me. That's the basis for true worship. And like the reformers from centuries ago, we today, it's still an issue for us. We must continue to live for the glory of God alone. As time on this earth nears an end, now is the time to firmly decide to stay true to Christ. Now is the time to make that commitment or renew that commitment that nothing, not economic pressure, not social pressure, not even the threat of death, nothing will ever cause us to worship anything or anyone or any organization but the loving God of heaven. Now is the time to make that decision, and may God help us to not only make that commitment, but even just as important, I was going to say more so, but just as important, may God help us to hold to that commitment. Come what may. Come what may. God and God alone. I cannot end this sermon without hearing that song made popular by Steve Green many years ago called God and God Alone. And as Sandra sings that song for us to close, I pray that you take the opportunity to make or renew your commitment today that your worship is going to be reserved for all time for God and only God.